process. I'm gonna jump all over the place, explain different features, what it does, before I even start at the beginning and go through it. So
Okay.
save the questions, we're gonna bounce all over the place for a while. What this machine is designed to do though, is to send butane through this material column, extracting our essential oil. That butane goes down into this collection. Once all the butane is in this collection, we close this blue ball valve and heat this collection to turn that butane into a vapor. Butane evaporates at a very low temperature, so warm water will turn it into a vapor quickly. That vapor travels through this line into the vapor port of this tank, which is sitting in dry ice, where that vapor is then condensed back into a liquid. So pretty straightforward. Butane in, extracts our oil, gets to the bottom, then we heat the bottom to turn it into a vapor. As that vapor travels into this tank, it condenses back into a liquid where we recapture it all. Our wax is left in this collection. Before we would open this at the end, which I'll repeat a whole bunch, you'll release the pressure in it, take this one clamp off, and now you can pour your wax or scrape your wax out of that bottom splatter pad, we call it. Obviously, there's a little bit more to it. Your machine is fairly advanced, meaning it's designed to put out the absolute highest purity extracts possible by extracting below -30. You will hear me say -30 a bunch. It's a very important number. At that temperature, fats, waxes, lipids, other impurities are basically locked out from our solvent. So we can send our butane below -30 into this column full of material, flood it full, soak it for a while, and as long as we stay below -30, we're never going to grab any of those impurities that we would have at room temperature. So, because it's so clean, it's designed to do a lot of live resin, diamonds and sauce, and make all of those ultra high-end dabs, but it doesn't have to be sub-zero. So you don't need to have dry ice in this column. Say you're making wax for edibles, crude for distillate. We don't really care about the color or grabbing a little bit of impurities because we're going to ingest it orally. It doesn't have to be ran sub-zero, but that's how I'm going to train you today. Once you kind of grasp that, all the rest of them are very easy. So the machine is highly versatile. It makes just about every dabbable product that there is except distillate and rosin. It's just a matter of how it's used. So butane, at 32 degrees, butane is a liquid. Above 32 degrees, it's vapor, and below 32 degrees, obviously, it stays liquid. So what we're doing is we want to keep butane as far below -30 as possible, which means our initial delivery tank filled with butane will also be sitting in dry ice. Our recovery tank will need to be in dry ice, so normally they're in the same cooler. I just kind of have them spread out so you can kind of make that visual connection. The butane in this tank, at 32 degrees, this butane is liquid. Above 32 degrees, it's vapor. Once we drop into the negative temperatures, not only does that butane go down to zero pressure, it actually pulls itself to a negative vacuum. So this tank full of butane sitting on dry ice will be at -30 vacuum. Because of that, we need nitrogen to assist that liquid into the extractor. The extractor itself will also be under vacuum, which again, I'll go over a bunch. So in order to get a -60, 70 butane into a vacuum down extractor that's also -60, 70, we use this nitrogen gas at a very low pressure to just kind of push that sub-zero liquid into the machine, and that's kind of how we move it around. Once this tank is empty, we will move that nitrogen line up to the material column and then push the remaining liquid from the column down from here just because it has a little bit more strength to it. But that's basically it. Our butane sits in dry ice, so we use nitrogen to push it into this material column. This valve will be closed at the time, so we will flood this full, we'll let it soak for a few minutes, open this valve back up. The nitrogen will push the remaining liquid into the material column. Once this tank is empty, the nitrogen moves over to here, we turn it up just a little bit, push that remaining liquid into this collection, close this blue ball valve, heat this base, recondense our vapor, and we're done. So that's how it's designed to run. Have you any closed loop experience at all? Anybody?
Any what?
Closed loop experience
No.
extracting? No? All first timers?
Yeah.
Awesome. It's really, really easy stuff. The nice thing about this is it comes with a 24/7 live support, which is my actual cell phone. There is nothing we can't fix in a matter of a minute or two, so don't hesitate to call me. On your first run, you might call me once or twice. I'll walk you through a thing or two. You're not going to need me again after that. They're very, very easy to use. So, nitrogen. Think of nitrogen as extremely clean air. It's inert, it's non-toxic, it's non-flammable, and it doesn't mix with butane, and that's why we use it to push it around. This tank, this is a very high pressure tank, so we need this regulator to tone it down to send it into the machine, obviously. So on this regulator, the compound gauge with the larger numbers, this is the pressure inside of the tank. A brand new tank is going to be around 2,600 PSI. This over here is what the outgoing pushes. We will increase it and decrease it by turning this little knob right, increase, left, decrease. When the knob is all the way left and kind of loose like this, that means nitrogen is completely locked out. So we can turn our tank on. It's telling us we have a 2,000 PSI tank because we pumped a little bit of pressure in this already. This is going to stay at 0 until I turn this to the right. Don't be startled, it's going to come out in a second. So that's it, very simple. That one got a little tight. But basically, we would use air if it wasn't so dirty. Keeping moisture and other impurities out of this process is very important. And nitrogen, this is a laser grade nitrogen, so it's very pure, non-toxic, so on and so forth. So, that's what we use our nitrogen for. When we get ready to do an extraction, this tank sitting in dry ice will be filled with butane, so it will have negative pressure. We will hook that nitrogen up to the vapor port of this tank. The vapor side is basically has nothing here, while the liquid side has a dip tube that goes all the way down. While having the nitrogen hooked to the vapor port, as soon as we introduce that little bit of pressure, it's going to force that sub-zero liquid up the dip tube and into the system. Now, for that initial push, it's only 20 PSI, maybe even 15 on a machine this small. It's a very, very low pressure. So when you turn your nitrogen on, hook everything up. Everything is always hand tight and then just barely snug. We'll double check that these are snug, which they are. We will turn this up. We'll do that first red dot, which is 20. So right now there's a positive 20 PSI of pressure right up to this vapor port, so that when we need it, we'll just kind of control it from here. Right now, your tanks are both closed because they're filled with nitrogen. If you ever buy a tank and it's not filled with nitrogen, take it right back. This basically guarantees that there's no air in it, so it's not going to rust in there. So when you get home and use these, open those up, let that nitrogen out, obviously, before you start. So right now we have our nitrogen set to 20 PSI, hooked to the vapor port of this tank. This tank is filled with our liquid butane, and it is also sitting in dry ice. So from there, our liquid valve leading into our extractor, we need everything to be open that isn't hooked to anything. So leading in, it's open into the column, open leading into our collection, and then it is open leading up to our recovery tank. This right now is closed because of that nitrogen, but in a normal situation, this will actually be open because it's empty. We are going to vacuum all of the air out of this whole machine before we start. So we need this tank to be open so we can vacuum the air out of this tank, this line, the collection, the material column, and the delivery line right up to this closed liquid valve, because again, that tank has butane in it, so we can't vacuum it. So the next step, after we set up the nitrogen, we have everything sitting where it needs to be. Let's say we fast forward for a second, you're gonna do your first extraction. We have plant material in this column. This is a filter plate kit right here, which I'll show you what it looks like before you go. There's a little compression ring in there that you'll pull out. You'll put your paper filters in, the compression ring goes back in and kind of holds them in place. That allows you to take this top off and pack this full of material with some force, because we're packing it against the steel plate down here. So anyways, packed full of material, paper filters in our filter plate kit. Our collection pot. Before you start an extraction, that needs to be sitting in ice water. We need it to be cold, but doesn't have to be crazy cold, not dry ice like the other two. Butane normally always wants to chase the coldest point. We call that thermodynamics. So without nitrogen, getting butane to go from a tank to a column means this column needs to be colder than that tank, so the butane is kind of drawn towards it. Because these are both incredibly cold, we need the nitrogen to push it there, or else it won't go. Now, the nitrogen also lets us bend the thermodynamic rules a little bit, meaning when we go to push all of that liquid into this collection, this material column is negative 60, maybe negative 70 or so. This is only going to be 32-ish or whatever, it's going to be ice water. The nitrogen is going to allow us to push that liquid down into our collection, and now this doesn't have to be cold enough to accept it on its own. It just needs to be cold so that it goes in nicely. So, anyways, before we start, this tank in dry ice, nitrogen is set to 20. We have plant material in our column, paper filters in our filter plate kit. Our collection pot is sitting in ice water. And then our recovery tank, which is open and empty, is also sitting in dry ice. Now, we vacuum down this machine before every extraction, because if there's any air anywhere in this machine, it will block the flow of our liquid. We call that an airlock or a vapor lock.
How do you vacuum it?
Well, you'll take your 6 CFM vacuum right there in that box. You'll hook it to this valve or this valve. It'll probably end up being this one. Once we turn that vacuum pump on, open this valve up. Both of these compound gauges are going to go down to -30 as we vacuum the air out of it. It's only going to take a second or two. There's not a lot of volume in this extractor. Once these read -30, we'll close this valve, kill that vacuum pump, take it back over to the oven or whatever it's going to be. We're done with it for the whole extraction. All it does is vacuum the air out before we start, and then it's gone. So everything is now under a full vacuum. So from the inside of this delivery line, the column, the collection, and our recovery tank is fully vacuumed down because again, that's empty. Once we do that vacuum, we want to close 2 valves after. The valve leading to the recovery tank gets closed. So now this tank is under a full vacuum, sitting in dry ice, just ready and waiting so that we know when we get to that point, it's fully vacuumed down and ready to accept that vapor. The only other valve that we're going to shut is this big blue one, because once we do introduce that liquid butane, this is where we want it to stop and flood this column full. So now that we have the air vacuumed out of it, the very last thing you will do before you deliver the liquid butane is put dry ice in this outer sleeve. We don't want to put dry ice in this sleeve until we've vacuumed the air out of it, because if there's a lot of moisture in the air, it will condense on the inside of the column and then we'll get water in our wax and our tanks. So once we vacuum down the air, we close 1 valve, we close 2 valves, now we can add the dry ice to that column. So we're basically ready to start our extraction. Now, this tank again is so incredibly cold that it's at a full vacuum on its own, and so is the material column it's leading to. So when we open this liquid delivery valve, absolutely nothing is going to happen until you open up this nitrogen. It'll sound like this once you open that nitrogen up. This liquid butane is so incredibly cold that as soon as it starts flowing through this line, the whole line will get taken over with frost as the moisture from the air kind of condenses to it. This whole valve will frost over. It's pretty impressive. But anyways, you feel the liquid flowing through the line. You can really feel it. There's no like guessing. Once this kind of slows down and stops like it just did, we know this material column is full. We are just going to let this sit and leave it alone for 5, maybe 10 minutes or so and let that butane soak into this material. There is more butane left in this tank, so once we get done with this soak and we open this valve up, the nitrogen is then going to be able to continue pushing the rest of that liquid into the machine. That's going to push the liquid in the column down into the collection. At that point, you will actually start seeing that nice gold liquid flowing down in there. You'll put a flashlight on one side, and it will illuminate the inside nicely. It's actually very clear. So anyways, we open up our liquid, we open up our nitrogen, we feel that liquid flowing through the line, it's filling up our column. The column is filled with dry ice, so you're not going to be able to tell that it's frosting over because it will already be covered. So as soon as we feel that liquid flow stop, we know this is full of butane. 10, maybe 15 minutes or so, we will let it sit here. Once we open up this valve, you will see an initial drop of liquid, and now our nitrogen can continue pushing the rest of the liquid out of this tank. There isn't a ton of liquid in there. So as you feel it flowing through the line, once you feel it stop, if you're not sure, empty tanks are very obvious. When we feel that liquid no longer flowing through this line, we will close that liquid valve, shut our nitrogen, shut our liquid off. All of the liquid butane from this tank has been delivered into the machine. We soak the material column. Once we open that valve, we then drain the rest of the liquid in. So now all of our liquid is in this extractor. A good portion of it is down in this collection where it's nice and cold, but this last column's worth wants to stay right here because it's so cold the butane kind of wants to stay in that spot. That's when we move this nitrogen up to that material column. So you make sure this tank is off. Undo this nitrogen line slowly. Tight and then snug, not too much. Stainless is pretty soft. So, once we move that up there, there's basically no rush to push the rest of this liquid out because it is so cold, we're not pulling any impurities. So take your time, shut the nitrogen off, disconnect it, hook it to the material column. This delivery line and the butane we're done with, so you can disconnect them and they're gone. Before we push the liquid from this material column down, we want to turn this up just a hair. So we'll turn this back on. Turn this back on, turn it up to, turn that up to 40. So now, as soon as we open this up, 40 psi nitrogen is going to push that liquid down. This liquid is so cold, it has no pressure. So 40 psi push of nitrogen is going to dump that shit down like it's not even there. So when you get ready to do this push, usually you'll be standing right here, you'll have a flashlight on one side, because as soon as we open this up, as we watch the liquid dumping into the collection, we want to be right here ready to close this valve, because as soon as that liquid stops, we want to close that valve. Now, it is going to be very quick. Open that nitrogen up, liquid's dumping in, it's dumping in, it's dumping in, it's dumping in. We start to kind of see it spit and sputter. You'll be right here to shut this one, shut the nitrogen. We have pushed the liquid from the material column down into our collection, but there's still a decent amount of residual liquid in here. So we will let this sit just a few minutes, 4 or 5. Let the residual liquid kind of settle to the bottom where it's the coldest. We'll turn that nitrogen back on and give it one more dump of liquid. It stops, close it, close it. So now we've officially pushed all of the liquid we're going to get out of this material column into that collection. All of the liquid that you lose in each extraction is lost to this plant material. So if you only do one nitrogen push and call it a day, you're going to lose a lot of your butane. But if you push it once, let it settle, push it twice, that's kind of how you make your butane go further. So at this point, all of our butane is now down in our collection. Our collection is sitting in cold water, low pressure, friendly we like to call it. So before we go any further, we'll release the pressure in this material column, take this clamp off, take the material column right off, dump the plant material out. We want to get the plant material out of this column before we go any further, because once this starts to dry and it kind of expands, the shit will never come out. So while it's a little bit wet, it pushes right up nicely. So from here up, everything is gone at this point. We have just our collection pot sitting in ice water, connected to a fully vacuumed down recovery tank sitting in dry ice. The only thing separating them is this valve right here. Now before we can open this valve to give that butane vapor access to this tank, we have to purge the nitrogen out of the way. So when we push the liquid down into that tank, some of the nitrogen made its way in behind it. Nitrogen will never mix with the butane, so it's sitting right above it like head pressure. Nitrogen you can't see and you can't smell. Butane you can clearly see and you can clearly smell. So as soon as you see that wavy butane vapor, close the valve, nitrogen's gone. If you open this up before we purge off that nitrogen, the nitrogen will be a perfect example of a vapor block blocking the flow of that butane. So by releasing it out of the way, we now know that there's no nitrogen to block the flow of our butane vapor from condensing into this tank. So now we can officially open this up. Once this valve is open, now we can heat this collection. You never want to put this on hot water until we've purged the nitrogen out of the way and then open this up and given that vapor somewhere to go, or obviously you'll just create a bunch of pressure inside the closed pot, and that's not a good idea. So, purge the nitrogen out of the way, open the valve to the recovery tank. Now we can take this out of the ice water and we can put it in our hot water bath. As soon as it gets to that hot water, the butane inside is going to look like boiling water. It's going to be rolling around. It evaporates at such a low temperature that, say, 120-degree water is going to create vapor rapidly. As that vapor travels through this line into this tank, it then condenses back into a liquid, because this tank is -70. Butane condenses into a